Mark Amerika is one of the people who, in many ways you could say, helped to institutionalize digital art as a practice, and certainly was one of the early innovators in the field of hypertext writing, but then has carried his work on through so many different types and genres, whether it be glitch, whether it be phone cinema, whether it be AI. Mark has consistently been an innovator in the sort of boundary between language and image and interactivity and networks. And Mark and Joe together were responsible for the initiation of the electronic book review so many years ago. So I'd like to welcome Mark to say a few words this morning.
I'm going to read an excerpt from, I think will be my contribution to the EBR compendium of comments about Joe and EBR's 30th. And it's a remix of one of the two essays I published in the Bloomsbury book. So I'm calling this one 2 or 3 Things. That one, I think that was 2 or 3 Things I Know About Electronic Literature, which of course is a remix of a title from a Godard film. This one's called 2 or 3 Things I Know About the Early History of Electronic Book Review and How Joe Tabbi and I Brainstormed Its Inception. So we're going to do some way back history. 2 or 3 things. So first, we didn't really know what we were doing. And I don't mean the creation of EBR was all dumb luck. On the contrary, as none other than Louis Pasteur once said, and I just saw this very line as I was thumbing through Agape, it's actually in there, and he is referencing Pasteur, chance favors the prepared mind. And Joe and I were prepared, at least to some degree. We had a common set of interests: postmodern literature, post-structuralist philosophy, and this new technology that we thought would change everything, the internet. But our relationship and the evolution of EBR started with books. So let's take a short trip inside the Wayback Machine. To be specific, let's go back to the early 1990s. It started with Black Ice magazine and Black Ice books, which you'll see a picture of a copy of that in the pamphlet. So in 1993, Black Ice Books, a paperback imprint of FC2, Fiction Collective, grew out of Black Ice magazine, which I edited with the late, great postmodern impresario Ron Sukenik. Now, the initial launch of Black Ice Books took place at the 1993 Vanguard Narrative Festival at Brown. And so that's where we began promoting or strategically positioning the books we were publishing as part of a new literary art movement that we called, anybody got it? Avant Pop. Look it up, Avant Pop. Okay. And when, after the Brown event, Ron and I got back to our respective writing studios in Boulder, Colorado, we decided to send all 4 of these Avant Pop Black Ice books to a few scholars, many of which were not that well known at the time, and one of whom we had already been in touch with and sent the Black Ice magazine, and who had started making a name for themselves in a little town in Kansas called Manhattan. And as Scott noted, it's the other Manhattan, the one where Joe Tabbi resided at the time. And without getting into the details, I would just say that one of the first great parties that I got to share with Joe Tabbi was the one that was conducted as part of my reception for my reading there, which was the first stop on the 16-city tour on my second novel, Sexual Blood. The first stop, Manhattan, Kansas. So Joe being Joe, Of course, he was totally open to receiving the books, the Black Ice books, and an engaged correspondence followed. Now, meanwhile, let's just have a little sidetrack here. In 1992, parallel to all of this book and magazine publishing, just as we were finishing production on the first set of Black Ice books, late 92, I founded AltX, ALTX, an online publishing venture that came into being before there really was a web-based graphical user interface with inline graphics. If you think of Mosaic, that came out in April of 1993. So AltX, that's still available as a living archive on altx.com, started as a Gopher site. Okay, look it up, Gopher site. The idea behind AltX was to, quote, our soon-to-be branded website, I'm going to quote it here, was to create an online hub of experimental writing where the digerati meet the literati. The digerati meet the literati. Center for Digital Narrative, where the digerati meet the literati. Are you feeling the vibes yet? So the site initially featured experimental literature, political rants, manifestos, visual art, streaming audio, and an eclectic mix of interviews with amazing writers and artists of the time. And it's all still there out in the archive. But I actually felt there was a crucial piece missing from the site, a piece that would in many ways become the centerpiece, the centering piece de resistance, a site-specific web of intellectual exchange that would feature truly provocative critics, scholars, artists, designers, creative writers, and independent thinkers musing on what was clearly happening at that moment in time, the transformational influence of network culture on the intellectual culture. Now, how to do that while remaining steadfast in our commitment to supporting the rival traditions in literature and critical theory that a like-minded comrade like Joe Tabbi would be uniquely positioned to invent. So as Joe and my dialogue intensified, AltX was starting to gain some notoriety. It was being written about or mentioned in the New Yorker, Spin magazine, if you remember that one, the New York Times, and many other publications, including a lot of new online publications, or what then became known as web publications. The literary publishing model of the future is what Publishers Weekly said. I mean, that was like the industry's go-to trade magazine. This is the context I'm sort of building because it soon became official that Joe would become the executive editor and co-founder of a new publication in the AltX network, and this, of course, was Electronic Book Review, EBR. So going back to Sukenik, or as Joe calls him, Saint Ron, being a cultural agitator, talking about Sukenik, someone who felt obliged or even devoted to disrupting both literary form and the too conservative publishing industry, and who practiced a politics or network of care, was all in on being our advisor. And I think this is important because Sukenik's cultural productions included not only his amazing experimental novels, but also the aforementioned fiction collective, of which he was a founder of, and that is now this year actually celebrating its 50th year anniversary. But he also, with me, founded Black Ice Books and Black Ice Magazine, and perhaps more importantly for us here today, the well-regarded American Book Review, also known as ABR. Do you see where the connection is? So soon it was decided that the launch of EBR would coincide with a special guest-edited issue of ABR. This meant that the initial slate of essays written for EBR, a picture of which you can see in the pamphlet, would also appear in print, thus showcasing EBR's quick evolving reputation as, and I'm going to quote a young gentleman of the time, Scott Repper, quote, the best place to find serious criticism of electronic literature and digital culture on the web, presented in an ingenious, remix-friendly database interface. That quote is from 2002, by the way. In that initial launch of essays, Joe introduces EBR. It's like December 30th, 1995, quote, to introduce an electronic book review in the very medium that is reducing book technology to a museum piece is to confront some of the more persistent cultural contradictions of the past few decades. This is the late age of print we're in, when all the books worth saving are being scanned into digital archives, and the very conception of the book as a fixed object is giving way to the hyper-reality of letters floating on the screen. And if you read through, or into, you might say, that opening paragraph a little bit further, you'll see shades of J. David Boulder, or when Joe says the argument has been made that technological change represents a happy convergence with developments in literary theory, shades of George Landau. Or when he says, and I think Ole mentioned this one as well, the end of books is more accurately the end of academic readings that isolate texts from the larger media ecology. The end of books, right? The title of a really important article written in the New York Times by Robert Coover. Joe was on to remix very early on, and he ends the essay with this line. This is the introductory essay to the first issue of EBR, addressing those who made it that far. Submissions are sought from critical writers of all stripes who are actively imagining the conditions under which a literary culture on the net might be possible. Which brings me to the second thing I know about the early history of the electronic book review and how Joe Tabbi and I brainstormed its inception. We knew exactly what we were doing. But at that time, we didn't have the easy go-to terms available to us that we do now. Back then, hypertext was popular. Then came cybertext. Has anyone in Bergen heard of the term cybertext? Of course, the cybertext book that Espen wrote became even more controversial when EBR published this sort of out of the blue essay. Cybertext killed the hypertext star. A very provocative essay written by another very young, sort of wet behind the ears scholar at that time, Nick Montfort. So no, when the EBR alt-Xers began our journey into web publishing, there was no such thing as electronic literature or digital humanities or radical open access. But that's to be expected because EBR and Joseph Tabbi were way ahead of their time. And this brings me to the last thing I know about, well, that I'll talk about now, that I know about the early history of electronic book review and how Joe Tabbi was modeling new ways of being a critical writer, an editor, and a cultural producer / provocateur. What we were doing, and specifically what Joe was envisioning, modeling, and putting into practice was, to borrow a phrase from our most excellent first EBR designer colleague, Ann Burdick, we were design writing future forms of going public. To go public as in to publish. And I wanted to really just focus the end of my presentation on that because we talk about Joe's editorial vision and his writing style, his mentoring, his critical acumen, the books that he's published. But a big part of our project also was to experiment with publishing, which I think sometimes gets a little bit unnoted. So what does it mean for those of us today who are ready, willing, and able to design, write future forms of, and I'll call it post-publishing, to carry the mantle of what my dear friend Joe Tabbi had the foresight to initialize and execute 30 years ago? So when I drop the phrase post-publishing, by the way, I'm borrowing that actually from the radical open access scholar Janneke Ademe. Has anybody read her book, Living Books, published by MIT? Highly recommend it. She's an amazing scholar. So you can read her and other colleagues' thoughts on post-publishing at their website. Just look it up. But here's how she describes this kind of, I think what she also refers to as research creation. And I'm going to quote liberally here. Post-publishing gathers together researchers and practitioners who, both collaboratively and individually, explore alternative pasts, presents, and futures for publishing. For us, reimagining what publishing is and what it does means performing it differently, beyond the commercial and humanist legacy systems that still dominate publishing, beyond a focus on books as objects and commodities and on binaries between print and digital, and beyond the way oppressions along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, ability, and language continue to shape our writing and publishing practices. We do so by actively intervening in the way research and writing is produced and disseminated and how communities and publics are created around it. Through our various engagements, working across borders of academia and activism, we want to stimulate the creation of networks of publishers, scholars, librarians, technologists, activists, artists, educators, and others from different fields and backgrounds, inside and outside the university, all committed to exploring alternative forms of publishing. So now looking back at how much influence EBR has had over the last 30 years, while reading Jannike's words, knowing how she is speaking truth to power and how much of it rings true and not only makes sense, but clarifies what the post-publishing mission is, we see the tremendous legacy that the work of Joe Tabbi and all the contributors to EBR have spawned and are still spawning and will continue to spawn thanks to what's happening here at the University of Bergen and the Center for Digital Narrative. Like Derrida, yes, I'm going there. Like Derrida, who we quoted on the very first homepage at the launch of EBR. The very first time we put it online, it was opened with a quote from Derrida. I choose to conceptualize Joe's legacy not as a fixed entity, but as a challenge to work against the idea of a fixed, stable inheritance. Legacies are not simply handed down, but are constantly reinterpreted and transformed through time and context. For Derrida, legacies are characterized by difference, meaning, as many of you know, they are both deferral and difference, always in a state of becoming. And this is how I'll always look at EBR, as it design writes the future. Thank you.